All right. Hi, everybody. Today I want to quickly talk to you about biosphere reserves. And biosphere reserves are a type of conservation effort, but they're not really well known in the United States so much. We do have some, but we don't have very many of them. At the time of making this video, there are 748 biosphere reserves spanning 134 countries, and in the United States, we have 28 of them. The biosphere reserves are managed by a branch of the United Nations called UNESCO, and UNESCO is an acronym for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And UNESCO has this program that they call the Man in the Biosphere program. And if you're like me, when you first read that, you think it's about some guy living in his sleeping bag inside a dome somewhere, but that's not quite what it means. This is a broader sense of the use of the term man. But anyway, UNESCO's program is called Man and the Biosphere program. So the Biosphere program has particular goals that it's attempting to achieve. These reserves are a coordinated global network of protected areas for scientific research and monitoring and representative samples of the world's ecosystems, with an emphasis on integrating conservation and development. So within the reserve, sustainable resource use and development is studied, so the reserve can become a model for rural development compatible with conservation. And the Man in the Biosphere program provides logistical support for research, monitoring, education, training, and information exchange. The biosphere reserves are set up with 3 zones within the reserve. And this is a conceptual layout of a biosphere reserve. And this is the same one you have in your readings. So let's talk specifically about the 3 zones. So first of all, the core zone that you see here and here, in this particular case, they provide legal protection for naturally or minimally disturbed ecosystems, meaning that the ecosystems are pretty much intact. Very few activities can take place in the core zone. So you cannot do any kind of manipulative research. However, it provides opportunities for ecological monitoring. So you can have a weather station there, for example. You could measure CO2 levels. You could do a measurement of population sizes of animals or trees or that type of thing. You could do plant transects to see how climate change is affecting the vegetational changes, but no manipulative research. That core zone functions as a reference point for the natural state of ecosystems represented by the particular biosphere reserve. Surrounding the core zone is the buffer zone, and you can see a solid line here, and the buffer zone surrounds the core zone to protect it from the outside land use. They do allow experimental research in the buffer zone. Educational activities can take place in the buffer zone, and public recreation or ecotourism can take place in the buffer zone. Other economic activities can also take place. If this was a marine biosphere reserve, for example, you would be allowed to do, say, sustainable fishing in this area. So you can see traditional land use here, and again, ecological monitoring. And again, that solid line represents the legal protection. So the buffer zone is the outermost limit of legal protection for the biosphere. Then finally, you get to the transition zone. The transition zone is not legally protected. That's represented by the dotted line here. And conservation is pursued through cooperation with the local people. So the local people pursue sustainable farming and practices and sustainable fishing if it's a marine area, or if it has a river or stream, that kind of thing, and also sustainable forestry and other economic activities that are compatible with sustainable resource use in protection of the core and buffer zone. And a sentence that really sort of puts it into perspective is it's a dynamic, ever expanding cooperation zone where the work of the biosphere is applied to the needs of the local people. Okay, so just in comparison to other things we've talked about, for example, biospheres are very different from national parks. So in a national park, historically in the United States, national parks were chosen for their spectacular scenery. We don't have, big cathedrals, big giant massive churches designed, 300, 400, 500 years ago, things of that sort. We don't have those. But we did have monuments of nature, essentially. So national parks were kind of representative monuments of nature that could sort of compete with monuments in Europe. That was the idea of them. Biosphere reserves are representative samples of the world's ecosystems, so they're not necessarily spectacular in terms of scenery. A lot of these places, it's more of a functional use rather than just to go see something beautiful, if you would. So in terms of national parks, no park in the U.S. was really chosen to protect fauna, and fauna are any kind of animals in particular. In fact, the bison were essentially wiped out of Yellowstone National Park, whereas in biosphere reserves, protection of biodiversity is a major goal. You would never be able to hunt the bison to extinction. So national parks are, in a way, islands of these natural areas surrounded by human-dominated landscapes. So in the original idea, you had this original perfect landscape uninhabited by humans, when in fact you used to have indigenous people like the Shoshone and Yellowstone, which were kicked out of the park as soon as the park was created. So the biosphere reserves tend to not do things like that. They tend to try to integrate human development, and they're designed to integrate biodiversity and conservation, so to reduce the conflict between humans and nature. So they're much more of a functional use with protected areas, but then also the idea is that we're learning from those areas to utilize that and benefit the people that live right outside the park, many of which live on the resources in that area. So that's really the big differences between national parks and biosphere reserves, and I hope that makes sense, and I'll talk to you all later.